When people talk about spies, they picture tuxedos and gadgets. Not a typewriter. A chipped teacup and lipstick smudged across a rationed napkin. But in 1943, that's exactly what we were. Women, invisible, overlooked, perfect. My name doesn't matter. It never did. I was one of dozens chosen not for our beauty or brilliance, but because no one would ever believe we could be dangerous. They trained us to vanish in plain sight, to move like mist through the corridors of power. Our orders were simple: observe, memorize, transmit. Our real mission was much harder. Survive long enough to make it matter. They called us clerks, typists, girls. We smiled, nodded, and wrote down their secrets while they bragged about how clever they were. I learned that arrogance is the spy's best weapon. Men so sure of their own superiority will never look closely at the woman bringing them coffee. The day I received my forged papers, the air in the briefing room felt too thin. A colonel handed me a German uniform and said, "From now on, your life belongs to silence." I still remember the smell. Ink, wool, fear. When I looked in the mirror wearing that gray jacket for the first time, I didn't recognize myself. I told the woman staring back, "You're going to die under another name." Crossing into enemy territory was nothing like the movies. No music, no courage. Just mud, cold, and the taste of copper in your mouth. Every time a checkpoint light passed over your face, I repeated my cover story until it replaced my heartbeat. Name, birthplace, occupation, favorite German poet. By the time I reached the compound, I almost believed it myself. Inside, the office hummed with paper and paranoia. Typewriters clattered like gunfire. I worked beside men who carried pistols but not suspicion. They talked freely about troop movements, supplies, rumors of invasion. Every sentence was a code to me, every laugh a map of who trusted whom. At night, I transcribed everything into invisible ink. The candlelight made my hands shake, but the rhythm steadied me. Strike, pause, breathe. Fear became background noise, a constant hum beneath the click of the keys. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We thought of ourselves as necessary. Each report we sent meant lives spared somewhere far away. Men we'd never meet. Children who'd never know our names. Sometimes I wondered if anyone in London even read the messages we risked everything to send. But that wasn't the point. Our job was not to be remembered. Our job was to make sure others survived long enough to forget us. By day I smiled. By night I disappeared into codes. They thought we were secretaries. They never realized we were rewriting the war right under their noses. It was a Thursday. I remember because the rain refused to stop. The office smelled of damp paper and metal. Captain Müller handed me a folder thicker than usual and lingered a second too long. His smile didn't reach his eyes. That's when I knew. Someone had started to suspect. Every lie has a rhythm. Mine was losing tempo. For months, I'd balanced truth and fiction like two glasses of water, both about to spill. Now one was tipping. He asked where I was from. I said, Cologne. He raised an eyebrow. You don't sound like it. A single sentence, and the room shrank around me. I heard my pulse louder than the rain. The typewriter key under my finger refused to move. Then the telephone rang, a harsh mechanical mercy. While he turned, I slid the folder beneath a stack of forms and forced myself to breathe. When he left, I nearly collapsed. That evening, I walked home under the blackout sky and burned 3 pages of evidence. The ashes curled like black petals. I whispered the names of the men who'd die if I failed. The fire hissed like a promise. Silence or death. Nothing in between. I thought of my mother in London. She believed I was a nurse. I wrote her letters full of lies about patients and tea breaks, pretending my hands weren't stained with secrets. Sometimes I wondered if she'd still love me if she knew the truth. That her daughter wore the enemy's uniform and spoke their language better than her own. There were nights when the mirror betrayed me. I'd stare at the reflection in the glass, and the woman looking back wore the expression of someone who belonged there. The uniform fit too well, the accent too natural. I started dreaming in German. That frightened me more than any soldier ever could. Some of us broke under the strain. One girl vanished after confessing her cover to the wrong man. We heard rumors. A truck. A ditch. Silence. Her name was erased from the records. But I still remember the color of her scarf. Blue, like the morning we trained under. Every day became an act of theater. We smiled when spoken to, laughed at the right jokes, and filed death behind cabinets marked confidential. The danger wasn't in what we did. It was in how ordinary it began to feel. One evening, Captain Miller returned with a rose he said reminded him of me. I thanked him, heart hammering. When he left, I tore the petals apart, flushing them piece by piece down the drain. They stained the sink red. That night, I realized something cruel. Surviving this war meant losing pieces of yourself small enough that no one else noticed, until you disappeared completely. We lived between breaths, between loyalties, between who we were and who we pretended to be. And somehow, through all of it, we kept smiling, because a smile could save your life, or end it. They called us the shadows behind the desks, and most days that's exactly what we were. Women were everywhere in that war, but few of us existed in reports. We signed documents that never bore our names, handled messages that vanished in fire before dawn. But somewhere inside that silence, I began to sense there were others, women like me, hidden across Germany, connected by fragments of risk and faith. It started with a paperclip, a small silver paperclip left crooked on my file one morning. It meant, "You are not alone." No one ever explained it aloud. They didn't have to. Spies speak in absences, in what isn't said, in what's left behind. A week later, an envelope arrived on my desk with a single typed line. Train 17 will change its cargo on the third night. No signature, no instructions, just the scent of lavender pressed into the page. I copied the message, hid it beneath my skirt, and burned the envelope over my candle after sunset. That night I met her. Her name was Elise, or so she claimed. Tall, thin, eyes too calm for wartime. We crossed paths outside a bakery under the curfew light. She whispered, "You have steady hands." And I replied, "You left a paperclip." We didn't smile. There was no handshake, no plan. But in that instant, the world felt less empty. Elise worked near the train station, typing manifests for the Gestapo's supply routes. She slipped numbers to me hidden inside recipes, shopping lists, even hymn lyrics. We built a rhythm of secrets. One she would start and I would finish. When I returned home each night, I wrote her codes into the seams of my skirt, stitching data into cloth-like confession. Soon I learned about others. A typist in Hamburg, a nurse in Bremen, a translator in Munich, a whole constellation of women scattered across occupied Europe, passing fragments of truth through invisible threads. Each of us risked everything, yet none of us would ever meet. Men led armies. We led whispers. They conquered with force. We endured with patience. It's easy to overlook a woman carrying bread. It's harder to see the message hidden beneath it. One evening, Elise didn't show. Her absence pressed heavier than any noise. The next day, the trains ran on schedule. No one asked questions. That's how we knew she was gone. I walked home that night through streets lit only by cigarettes and fear. Somewhere a piano played a song I used to love. I wondered if Elise had ever danced. If she'd known her last words would be numbers. People think spies die in gunfights or explosions. Most of us just disappear quietly between two sentences. But I promised myself one thing as I passed the checkpoint. If I lived, I'd remember every name the world forgot. We were invisible, yes, but not unseen. The war noticed us even when history wouldn't. And sometimes being invisible was the only way to make the truth visible. After Elise vanished, the office felt colder. Her desk remained empty for weeks. Yet no one dared remove it. I kept catching my eyes drifting toward the chair, waiting for the soft sound of her typewriter. Instead, there was only the ticking clock above the filing cabinet. Steady, merciless, indifferent. Then one morning, a melody found me. A faint tune hummed by a courier as he sorted files. At first, I barely noticed it. But when I listened closer, the pattern clicked. 3 short notes. Too long. Morse for you. He repeated it, changing tempo, hiding code inside the rhythm. I realized the song wasn't random. It was a message. The melody guided me to a sheet of requisition forms left unsigned. Between the lines of type, faint indentations spelled out a phrase. Berlin April movement confirmed. It wasn't Elise's handwriting, but it carried her style. Precise, almost tender. She'd trained someone new. Her work lived on through music. That discovery kept me alive. It reminded me that even when one of us vanished, the current kept flowing underneath. Information moved like breath through the walls. Every song, every cough, every misplaced stamp could be a thread in the web. Once an officer asked me why I always wore gloves indoors. I told him the typewriter ribbon stained. The truth was different. The gloves hid the small cuts from where I'd stitched microfilm into my sleeves. A single strip could carry an entire map. A single tear could expose everything. One afternoon, I was ordered to deliver documents to the headquarters radio room. My heart hammered as I entered. Rows of equipment, dials glowing faintly in the dusk. A man tuned frequencies, static whispering secrets. As I passed him the folder, I caught sight of a chart. Lists of intercepted transmissions marked. Unverified, female source. I felt both pride and terror. They knew we existed, but they didn't know where to look. That night I returned home and turned on my wireless. Static filled the room. Then faint music. The same melody from the courier. I closed my eyes and imagined Elise smiling somewhere, whispering through the air. "We're still here." From then on, I hid messages in songs too. Simple ones. Hymns, lullabies, even propaganda marches twisted into code. The trick was subtlety. The secret lived not in the lyrics, but in the rhythm. The pauses where no one thought to listen. War teaches you that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hums softly in a forgotten hallway, waiting for someone brave enough to hear it. People often ask me years later how we endured it all. I tell them endurance wasn't bravery. It was harmony. Each of us was a single note, fragile and small. But together, we were a symphony that outlasted tyranny. And even now, when I hear that melody on an old radio, the order came hidden inside a grocery list. 3 onions, 1 loaf, no milk. That meant meet at midnight. I burned the paper as soon as I read it, watching the ink curl like smoke from a confession. Midnight came wrapped in fog. I walked along the canal, my breath fading into the mist, counting steps like prayers. 13 to the bridge, 7 to the gate, 4 to the warehouse door. Inside waited 2 men and a woman I didn't know. They said her name was Greta. She never smiled. Her eyes moved the way a blade does, quietly, efficiently, without warning. She placed a small metal box on the table. Inside, beneath layers of brown paper, lay the reason we were all risking our lives. A detonator disguised as a radio part. Our mission was to plant it inside a fuel depot 3 miles north. A spark to cripple supply lines before an Allied offensive. I wanted to refuse. Sabotage wasn't my job. I was a ghost, not a soldier. But refusing meant questions, and questions meant suspicion. So I nodded. They gave me a new identity. Anna Wrights, mechanical assistant. Greta would pose as my superior. The 2 men would transport crates marked communications. We rehearsed our story until our tongues ached from false words. The next morning, we boarded the supply truck. Rain blurred the horizon into a single sheet of gray. I could smell gasoline through the canvas. Greta sat beside me, silent. Her hands rested on the box as if she could already feel the explosion humming inside it. At the checkpoint, a young guard leaned into the truck. He couldn't have been older than my brother. He asked where we were headed, and Greta answered too quickly. Her voice cracked, and his eyes narrowed. For one heartbeat, I thought it was over. I leaned forward, smiled, and said, "She hasn't slept in 2 days. We're behind schedule again." The guard hesitated, then waved us through. As the gate closed behind us, Greta exhaled. "That was close," she whispered. "No," I said. "That was luck." That night we reached the depot. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rain. We worked in silence, pretending to repair wiring while sliding the device into a hollow beam. Every sound felt louder than thunder. When it was done, we walked away without looking back. Half an hour later, the sky turned white. The explosion didn't sound like victory. It sounded like guilt. Flames rose higher than the rooftops, and in their glow, I saw Greta's face for the first time. Not cold, not cruel, just terrified. The next day, the newspapers called it sabotage. Dozens dead, hundreds injured. They celebrated efficiency. I heard screams in every headline. I'd always believed information could save lives. That night, I learned it could take them just as easily. The order came hidden inside a grocery list. 3 onions, 1 loaf, no milk. That meant meet at midnight. I burned the paper as soon as I read it, watching the ink curl like smoke from a confession. Midnight came wrapped in fog. I walked along the canal, my breath fading into the mist, counting steps like prayers. 13 to the bridge, 7 to the gate, 4 to the warehouse door. Inside waited 2 men and a woman I didn't know. They said her name was Greta. She never smiled. Her eyes moved the way a blade does, quietly, efficiently, without warning. She placed a small metal box on the table. Inside, beneath layers of brown paper, lay the reason we were all risking our lives. A detonator disguised as a radio part. Our mission was to plant it inside a fuel depot 3 miles north. A spark to cripple supply lines before an Allied offensive. I wanted to refuse. Sabotage wasn't my job. I was a ghost, not a soldier. But refusing meant questions, and questions meant suspicion. So I nodded. They gave me a new identity. Anna Wrights, mechanical assistant. Greta would pose as my superior. The 2 men would transport crates marked communications. We rehearsed our story until our tongues ached from false words. The next morning, we boarded the supply truck. Rain blurred the horizon into a single sheet of gray. I could smell gasoline through the canvas. Greta sat beside me, silent. Her hands rested on the box as if she could already feel the explosion humming inside it. At the checkpoint, a young guard leaned into the truck. He couldn't have been older than my brother. He asked where we were headed, and Greta answered too quickly. Her voice cracked, and his eyes narrowed. For one heartbeat, I thought it was over. I leaned forward, smiled, and said, "She hasn't slept in 2 days. We're behind schedule again." The guard hesitated, then waved us through. As the gate closed behind us, Greta exhaled. "That was close," she whispered. "No," I said. "That was luck." That night we reached the depot. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rain. We worked in silence, pretending to repair wiring while sliding the device into a hollow beam. Every sound felt louder than thunder. When it was done, we walked away without looking back. Half an hour later, the sky turned white. The explosion didn't sound like victory. It sounded like guilt. Flames rose higher than the rooftops, and in their glow, I saw Greta's face for the first time. Not cold, not cruel, just terrified. The next day, the newspapers called it sabotage. Dozens dead, hundreds injured. They celebrated efficiency. I heard screams in every headline. I'd always believed information could save lives. That night, I learned it could take them just as easily. From that moment, the codes didn't feel clean anymore. Every number I transmitted carried weight. Every letter could be someone's final word. Greta disappeared 3 days later. Her name erased. Her memory buried under smoke. Maybe she escaped. Maybe she didn't. Either way, the network kept moving. And so did I, though each message left another scar no one could see. The war was changing, and so were we. Spies turned into executioners, secrets into weapons. And somewhere inside me, a small, quiet voice began to whisper, "What if we've become the thing we swore to destroy?" After the depot burned, suspicion spread like fever. The officers were nervous, the clerks quieter than usual. Someone in our ranks had talked. Or so they said. The Gestapo began questioning everyone, starting with the women. Since, I stopped trusting everyone, even the ones I'd risked my life beside. We met now in daylight, pretending to gossip about ration coupons or silk stockings. Each smile hid a question. "Are you still one of us?" I couldn't tell anymore. The war had turned us into mirrors, reflecting whatever face was safest to show. One evening, I received a note slipped under my door. It read, "You've been compromised. Burn everything." No signature, no mark, just the faint scent of cigarette smoke. My hands shook as I gathered the files, the codes, the tiny strip of microfilm hidden in my comb. I hesitated over one photograph, the network's first gathering, back when Elise was still alive. I folded it once, twice, and tucked it into my shoe. Then I lit the match. The flames licked the edges of my table, devouring every piece of proof that I'd ever existed. When it was done, I sat in the dark, surrounded by ashes and silence. That's when I heard it. A knock. 3 short, 2 long. Our signal. I opened the door to find a young woman I'd never seen before. Her hair was cropped, her eyes sharp with exhaustion. She handed me a small radio transmitter and whispered, "You're in charge now." Then she was gone. I stared at the device in my hands. It was smaller than a book, lighter than guilt, and heavier than trust. Leadership wasn't an honor. It was a curse passed down by ghosts. For weeks I coordinated messages alone, unsure who was still listening. Sometimes the replies came instantly. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Each silence felt like another death. I learned that fear isn't loud. It's patient. It sits beside you at breakfast, follows you down corridors, and waits until you start to believe it's gone. Then it whispers your name. By winter I had stopped sleeping. My hands trembled constantly, stained by ink and paranoia. The line between ally and enemy had blurred beyond recognition. The only person I trusted was the voice in my head telling me to keep moving. War had stolen our countries, our names, our innocence. But worst of all, it had stolen the luxury of believing anyone completely. Sometimes I wonder if that's how tyranny truly wins. Not by conquering cities, but by convincing you that no one beside you can be trusted again. That winter, I stopped writing under orders. I started writing for memory. Because even if none of us survived, the story had to. And this is the story I promised myself I would live long enough to tell. They called it routine. But nothing in those rooms was routine. One by one, they dragged typists, nurses, translators behind closed doors. Some returned pale and trembling. Some didn't return at all. I knew it was only a matter of time before they reached my name. So I did the only thing that made... We used to say the city had two maps. One made of streets, and one made of fear. On the first, you could find bakeries, offices, and tram stops. On the second, you found silences, shadows, and the people who had vanished between one address and the next. I learned both maps by heart. The first kept me alive. The second told me why. By now I was alone again. The network had become a rumor even to itself. Sometimes a coded message would arrive, but I no longer trusted the handwriting. Elise's melody still echoed in my memory. 3 short, 2 long. Hope disguised as rhythm. I used to hum it when walking past checkpoints. Now I walked in silence. Music felt dangerous. It began with whispers about a man named Adler. No one had seen him, but everyone claimed he was listening. He didn't interrogate. He invited. He didn't threaten. He offered safety, food, a way home. That was how you caught spies now. With comfort. People could resist pain, but not kindness. I understood that better than anyone. I started tracing his presence, the way one follows, the smell of smoke after a fire, arrests that made too much sense, letters intercepted before being sent, couriers who vanished the morning after small confessions. Adler wasn't guessing. He was being fed. Someone inside was helping him. Late one night, I spread every scrap of information across my table. Ticket stubs, ration cards, coded notes. The paper looked like snowfall. I marked dates and times, drew circles, crossed lines. Slowly, a pattern emerged. A thread winding through every disappearance. The trail always curved back to a single address. An administrative office 2 floors below my own. Adler was closer than any of us imagined. He didn't hunt from outside. He lived inside our walls. The realization didn't shock me. It chilled me. I had passed him in the corridor, maybe even said, "Good morning." I wondered if he knew my handwriting, if he'd already read this confession in my mind before I wrote it. I changed everything after that. New routes, new faces, new habits. I stopped meeting contacts twice in the same place. I changed my perfume because scent can betray faster than words. I left harmless documents in plain sight and watched to see who touched them. Paranoia wasn't madness. It was mathematics. Every move a variable in a formula that decided whether I lived another day. A week later, a note appeared on my desk. 1 sentence, neatly typed. He uses kindness. No signature, no source. But the phrase cut through me like a whisper from a grave. Whoever wrote it understood him. Adler didn't coerce people. He persuaded them that surrender was relief. He spoke softly and made you thank him for the rope. That night, I went to a small cafe near the post office, pretending to write letters while scanning reflections in the window. A violin played outside, weaving through the rain. The tune, 3 short, 2 long. Elise's melody. My heart almost stopped. I stepped outside, and the musician looked up. A woman younger than I remembered Elise, but with the same calm defiance in her eyes. She nodded once and said, "The weather in April will be restless." "Code," I replied. "We should bring umbrellas." She smiled faintly, then turned away. I never saw her again. When I returned home, the radio was already on. Static, then faint music. The same violin pattern, looping endlessly. A message, or maybe a memory. It didn't matter anymore. I understood what it meant. We are still here. But were we? Every sound felt like surveillance. Every kindness felt like a question. I dreamt of Adler not as a man, but as a shadow sitting politely at my table, drinking my tea, waiting for me to speak first. And each morning when I put on my uniform, I wondered whether the woman who looked back from the mirror still belonged to London, or to the silence that swallowed her friends one by one. The war had taught me many languages, but the most dangerous one was trust. And now, trust spoke with Adler's voice. He invited me to a cafe near the museum, a quiet corner of the city, where people pretended life was normal, the kind of place where the world seemed too civilized for betrayal. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. Like a memory you could slip on. He arrived exactly on time. Of course he did. He wore a gray suit, modest but immaculate, and carried a folder under one arm. When he saw me, he smiled. Not the smile of an interrogator, but of a man pleased by predictability. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, as if we were meeting for coffee between friends. He didn't offer his name. He didn't need to. Names were for people with futures. We spoke of nothing for several minutes. Weather, books, bread. He was disarming in the way only intelligent men can be, completely unhurried. I realized he had mastered the art of making silence feel polite. Then, without changing tone, he said, "You've been recommended for a transfer." He slid the folder toward me. "Radio operations. It's important work. Safer, too. Safer." The word landed like a bruise. Inside the folder was a single page, typed cleanly with a list of names and dates. Some I recognized. Some were dead. At the bottom, my alias waited beside a blank line for signature. I didn't touch the pen he offered. He smiled again, gentle as ever. "You're bright," he said. "You could help bring order back to the world." For a heartbeat, I believed him. I imagined a version of myself who said yes, who traded fear for stability. I saw her sitting at a desk, filing reports, eating warm bread, a woman who survived by surrendering. But then I remembered Elise, Greta, and the nameless women who died believing truth was worth the danger. Their ghosts sat beside me, waiting for my answer. "I'm not qualified," I said. My voice didn't shake. "You underestimate yourself," he replied. "No," I said. "I know exactly what I am." He looked at me carefully, as if studying a specimen. Then he asked almost kindly, "Would you at least recommend someone else?" I understood the trap instantly. If I named another, he'd have both of us. So I smiled, because that's what women like me were trained to do. "No one I know would suit," I said. He studied my face, searching for cracks. Finding none, he leaned back and sighed. "The war will end soon," he said. "We'll all have to choose who we become after." He stood, straightened his jacket, and left payment on the table. Too much. A small courtesy, or a warning. When he reached the door, he paused. "Do stay warm," he said. "Spring winds can be cruel." Then he walked away into the rain. I stayed long after he'd gone, staring at the folder still sitting in front of me. Outside, the city went on breathing. A tram bell echoed through the street. And for a moment, I wanted to believe I'd passed the test. But deep down, I knew the opposite was true. It had only begun. That night, I transmitted a message to London. Adler confirmed. Uses persuasion, not force. Approach, psychological infiltration. The reply came hours later. Hold position. Await confirmation. No comfort, no praise. Just cold duty. Maybe that's how wars are won. By people too exhausted to need reassurance. I didn't sleep. Every creak in the floor sounded like a footstep. Every reflection looked like him standing just beyond reach. I realized then what made Adler so dangerous. It wasn't his power to kill. It was his power to make you question what you believed you were fighting for. In the days that followed, I saw him everywhere. In mirrored shop windows, in train glass, even in the still surface of my teacup. Sometimes I thought I heard his voice in the static, telling me to rest, to stop pretending this mattered. And maybe part of me wanted to. But every morning I pinned my false name to my uniform again, because surviving was its own act of defiance. Because silence, once chosen for fear, can also become a weapon when used for truth. The world around us was collapsing, and none of us knew what would come after. But I did know one thing. If Adler was the face of control, then I would become the echo that refused to fade. I didn't need to win. I only needed to remain impossible to erase. The radio began to sound like weather. Pressure rising, pressure falling, storms without rain. Reports came thin and frantic. Bridges collapsing in the east, columns pushing westward. Trains stranded like bones across the countryside. The map on the wall at headquarters shed its pins the way trees shed leaves. Every morning there were fewer flags than the night before. The men called it redeployment. We who filed their words called it what it was. Retreat. I kept the transmitter inside a hollow dictionary. German to English. English to German. Some nights I opened it and pretended I was only studying grammar, not treason. The coil warmed beneath my palm. A living thing. I tuned at dawn and near curfew, when voices move more safely through air. London answered in syllables of snow. Confirm. Survive. Wait. The verbs felt colder than the room. The city learned a new rhythm. The stutter of shortages. The pause of power cuts. The long flat line of streets gone silent before dusk. Our second map, the map of fear, changed too. Corners that were safe became traps. Doors that had hidden friends now hid no one. The violinist vanished. So did the cobbler. So did the baker with the generous sugar. I added their names to the list I would never show anyone. Adler's presence became a smell. Clean paper, soap, polished wood. I found it in places I hadn't looked for him. A note that said thank you on a requisition I hadn't filed. A chair pulled out an inch from a table I never used. My alias pronounced flawlessly by someone who shouldn't have known it. He was less a hunter than gravity. You didn't see him. You felt yourself bend. Then came the message that changed everything. A whisper threaded through static like a needle. Convoy west, 3 nights. River crossing, midnight. Stop them and they stopped the city. It was so direct it felt like a lie. We never got gifts like that. Gifts meant bait. But what if it wasn't? What if this was the moment all our small, quiet years were meant for? I went to the office early and watched the corridor like a patient watches a clock. A clock sneezed. A lamp hummed. The world wore its most ordinary mask. On my desk sat a folder I hadn't left there. Blank paper inside. One page dented faintly by a handwriting pressed on it elsewhere. I shaded the page with the side of a pencil, and the indentations rose like footprints in snow. Midnight Bridge, no names. The plan, if it was a plan, would need more people than I had left. So I rehearsed a smaller version. Warn the 2 couriers still breathing. Feed London the coordinates. Stall the office radio by mislabeling frequencies. And smuggle a single line into the nightly dispatch that would slow the convoy by 1 crucial hour. It would be delicate. Too delicate. A single error in the corridor would snap shut like a jaw. That evening I walked the length of the river as if measuring it for the last time. The water moved dark and patient beneath the bridge, carrying reflections away before they finished forming. I thought of Elise, of Greta, of the girl who placed a transmitter in my hands and said, "You're in charge now." I thought of Adler, the librarian of futures, and wondered which shelf he had put me on. Back home I cleared the table, set the dictionary down, and tuned the frequency until the room filled with moth sound. "London," I whispered, and for the first time in months I said it like a prayer. "Convoy west. 3 nights. Bridge at midnight. I can slow them, not stop them." The reply came almost human. "Your breath, not your blood. Delay, do not die." It was the closest thing to kindness I had ever heard from that voice. I prepared the paperwork like a dressmaker cuts cloth. Slowly. Precisely. Wrong in a way that would only matter later. 1 digit transposed in a frequency. 1 stamp misaligned on a requisition. 1 note about fuel that would lead A quartermaster. To the wrong gate at the right hour. Nothing dramatic. Only sand poured into the hinge of an iron door. At curfew, I crossed the yard with a bundle of forms, hugged close to my ribs and a mouthful of copper. A guard glanced up, bored, then down again. I walked through the door that had always opened and prayed. It would not learn a new trick. Inside, the radio room breathed its low animal breath. I slid the wrong-right papers into the right-wrong slots, nodded to the operator, and left my heartbeat on his table. Outside, the air tasted like rain. I didn't go home. I went to the bridge and stood among shadows that had learned to keep quiet. Midnight came in a single breath. The convoy's first lights appeared on the far road, small as buttons. Then the second road filled with stalled trucks, the ones my digits had nudged elsewhere. Horns, shouted orders. A jam built like a wall of noise. I felt the city tilt toward survival by a fraction. Then I felt him behind me. "Cold night," Adler said, as if we were neighbors. I didn't turn. "Spring winds can be cruel," I answered because I couldn't help myself. We watched the lights together, two citizens admiring the weather. "I offered you safety," he said. "You offered me an education," I said. "Did I?" His voice was curious, not offended. "What did you learn?" "I let the truth out like steam. That kindness without freedom is only a slower kind of cage." He sighed, the way a teacher sighs at a clever student who insists on failing correctly. "You won't live long enough to see whether that sentence is true," he said. "Perhaps," I said. "But it will still be true." The jam on the far road tightened. Shouts braided into panic. Somewhere a siren woke up late. Adler studied the water. "You moved an hour with ink," he said softly. "Impressive." It wasn't praise. It was a diagnosis. Then he did something I will never forget. He stepped aside, not merciful, not cruel, simply stepped aside, as if my path and his were lines on a map that hadn't touched yet. "Tomorrow you'll find a folder on your desk," he said. "Inside will be the correct frequencies for the week. Use them," he paused. "Or don't." "Why, tell me?" I asked. "Because the war is ending," he said. "And I prefer my ending simple." He left, his footsteps absorbed by the river's patient mouth. I stood alone until the convoy's lights began to move again. When the first trucks finally crossed, the hour I had stolen had become a small, precise mercy. Not victory! A notch in the hinge. Back in my room, the transmitter's coil still remembered my touch. The dictionary still weighed more than words. I sent one line, "Delay achieved, alive," and turned the dial down until static became sleep. The last thing I heard was the ghost of Elise's melody, playing where no violin stood. 3 short, 2 long, a heartbeat disguised as music. The city's or mine, I couldn't tell anymore. The morning after the bridge felt borrowed, like wearing someone else's life for a day. The office smelled of wet wool and paper that had learned to drown. Men moved faster than their thoughts, boots echoing over tile floors, voices tripping over fear disguised as efficiency. A new list hung on the notice board. Temporary transfers, emergency postings, updated frequencies. My alias was there. Radio operations. A promotion, they said. I thought of Adler and almost laughed. Promotions are just prettier names for traps. I went to my desk. The folder he'd promised was waiting, unassuming and patient. Not a threat, not a weapon. An invitation. Inside were frequencies, dates, and codes, all lined in perfect order, like soldiers waiting for inspection. Power and betrayal looked the same when written neatly. I could use it to protect what was left of my network or to end it quietly. That is what they never teach you about control. It feels identical on both sides of the table. I opened the hollow dictionary and touched the transmitter hidden inside. It was warm, alive, like a pulse that didn't belong to me anymore. "London," I whispered. "I am offered a promotion I can't refuse without refusing to live. What do you advise?" Static crackled, then a voice. "If capture risk rises, burn. If survival allows, echo." 2 sentences that canceled each other out. And in between them, my choice. Echo meant stay long enough to turn the system against itself. Escape meant disappear before it consumed me. I wanted both. I would be allowed neither. I read the frequencies in daylight. They were elegant, logical. Mathematics pretending to be mercy. The author believed order could outlive collapse. I marked 3 places where a delay of seconds could ripple into safety for hundreds. One at noon, one at dusk, one at the hour men mistake for mercy. I copied nothing. I memorized everything. Then I slid the folder back, straightened the edges, and went to the radio room like a woman walking into her own reflection. They greeted me with the politeness of exhaustion. No warmth, just rhythm. The room hummed with low energy, the breathing of machines older than loyalty. I took my seat and listened. The air smelled of metal and dust, like history oxidizing. Messages poured through in endless waves. Requisitions, shortages, apologies. Somewhere inside all that noise hid the heartbeat of a dying empire. For 2 days I only listened. I learned the cadence of collapse, the pauses when men waited for orders that never came, the coded despair of clerks trying to keep their departments from vanishing. Between the orders and the propaganda were small, unrecorded signals, a mother asking for a letter, a soldier whispering a name before the line cut. War has 2 frequencies, the official one and the human one. I transmitted the first. I kept the second. On the 3rd day, I touched the first delay point, a single code repeated once too long, just enough to move a convoy by minutes. No one noticed. On the 5th day, another pause disguised as interference. Static covered my heartbeat. On the 7th day, the last hinge. The hour called mercy. I delayed 3 beats. Somewhere far away, someone lived longer because of it. Maybe a minute, maybe a lifetime. I would never know. That was enough. That night, I went home and sat by the window, watching the city dim like an old photograph. Every sound felt final. The hum of trams, the murmur of tired voices, the whisper of rain. The air carried the smell of endings. I turned on the radio not to listen, but to keep from hearing my own thoughts. Adler never summoned me again. He didn't need to. His absence was louder than his presence. I could feel him in reflections, in glass, in teacups, in the polished brass of door handles. His power was to make me imagine him everywhere. That's how control survives, by becoming habit. By the 8th day, the horizon glowed orange from the east. Not sunrise, fire. Rumors of surrender drifted like ash. People began to pack lives into small boxes, as if preparing for judgment. I received a photograph slipped into my coat pocket. Women around a table, light on their faces, not from lamps but from hope. Elise, Greta, me. On the back, one line. We built this so you could get out. I held it until the ink warmed under my fingers. Out. Such a small word. Such a vast promise. I opened the dictionary one last time. London. I whispered, the path is open. The reply came clean, without static. Then go. No praise, no farewell. Just permission. I packed quickly. The scarf that still smelled of rain. The comb that once carried microfilm. The photograph. I left a note in the hollow dictionary. For whoever opens this next, you are braver than the one before. I didn't sign it. We never sign. At the door, I hesitated. The transmitter still radiated faint warmth, like memory refusing to die. Echo or escape. If I left, the signal would stop. If I stayed, the signal might outlive me. I chose the only answer that sounded like life. I chose continue. I walked the second map one last time. Past the cafe that forgives rain, the church that kept our frequencies, the bridge that learned our secrets. The city breathed quietly, pretending it hadn't seen me leave. At the station, a woman in a blue scarf checked my papers and said softly, "Spring winds can be kind too." I nodded but didn't look up. If I did, I might have stayed. The train pulled out slow like an exhale. The city slid backward, windows blinking like tired eyes. I opened the photograph again and traced each face. We built this so you could get out, the back said. I pressed it to my chest and finally believed it. People imagine the end of war sounds like cheering. Sometimes it sounds like iron on tracks and a woman repeating her real name under her breath until it feels like hers again. Sometimes it sounds like a radio left on in an empty room, humming to no one, refusing to stop. That's how I want to be remembered. Not as the woman who escaped, but as the echo that refused to fade. When the train finally stopped, no one spoke. The air smelled of coal and rain, the kind of air that doesn't belong to winners or losers. Outside, soldiers moved without formation, their uniforms mismatched, patches of one flag sewn over another. Liberation looked nothing like I imagined. It was neither joy nor vengeance. It was exhaustion wearing someone else's smile. I stepped onto the platform clutching my papers, half expecting a hand to grab me back. None did. No checkpoints, no questions. Just people walking like they'd forgotten how to hurry. A man offered me coffee from a tin cup, and for a heartbeat, I didn't know how to accept kindness without suspicion. The warmth burned my tongue, but it reminded me I was alive. In the distance, a loudspeaker declared the war officially over. The words echoed flat against the station walls. No one cheered. We'd all spent too long listening to voices that said, official. Freedom, like fear, needed time to sound believable. A young officer asked for my identification. I handed him my forged papers. He skimmed them and frowned slightly. "You're with communications?" he asked. I nodded. "You're being reassigned to documentation," he said. I almost laughed. From spy to archivist in one sentence. "Congratulations," he added without irony. "You survived the wrong side." He pointed me toward a temporary office building built from scrap metal and optimism. Inside, the walls were covered with names, lists of the missing, the found, the confirmed dead. People lined up to read them, fingers trembling as they searched for ghosts. Some smiled when they found what they wanted. Some wept. Both reactions looked the same. I found a desk at the back and began sorting through papers. Reports of recovered prisoners, destroyed records, warehouses full of belongings with no owners. Each file felt heavier than any secret I had ever carried. War taught me to hide information. Peace demanded I uncover it. That night, I was assigned a cot in a room with 5 other women. We didn't talk. We didn't ask names. We had learned too well that names could be dangerous. In the dark, someone whispered a prayer in French. Another answered in Polish. I stayed silent, but I mouthed Elise's melody. 3 short, 2 long. It felt like breathing again. The next morning, they asked for interpreters. My voice spoke before my fear could stop it. "I can translate German documents." A lieutenant looked up. "You're fluent?" I nodded. Fluent enough to forget who I was. He didn't understand, but he gave me a badge. For the next weeks, I translated files from the very offices where I'd once hidden messages. Memos, reports, correspondence between men who believed their orders would outlive them. The words crawled across the pages like insects. Precise, bureaucratic, soulless. I recognized some signatures. They'd once passed through my hands. Disguised as logistics. Now they were evidence. Each page I translated was a mirror turned inward. The same paper I used to smuggle hope now carried history's guilt. And yet, for the first time, I could read openly without fear of footsteps behind me. Freedom felt fragile, but it was still freedom. The days blurred into one another. Coffee, papers, silence. Outside, the city began to rebuild. Windows replaced the plywood that had replaced glass. Children's laughter returned like birds unsure if winter was truly over. But inside, the war still breathed through us. We all carried it in fragments. Habits, reflexes, ghosts. One evening, as I sorted files, I found a list marked Personnel Foreign Operatives. My pulse slowed. Names, dates, code names. My own alias sat among them, typed neatly as if I were just another statistic. Next to it, in red pencil, a single word. Confirmed. No note, no detail. Just that. I stared at it until the ink blurred. Confirmed what? Confirmed missing? Confirmed dead? Confirmed expendable? I folded the page and placed it in my pocket. Maybe that was the universe's way of offering me erasure. Maybe confirmed was a second chance to be forgotten properly. I'd spent years pretending to be someone else. Perhaps I'd finally succeeded. The next morning, an American officer approached me while I was translating. "You were in communications?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. He set a radio on my desk, its metal casing scuffed but intact. "We found this in an abandoned building," he said. "It still works. You seem to know how to handle one." I brushed my fingers over the knobs. The coil still remembered warmth. That night, I tuned it again out of habit. Static filled the room like dust. Then faintly a sound. 3 short, 2 long. I froze. No violin this time. A signal. My breath caught. "Elise?" I whispered absurdly. The pattern repeated, then stopped. Silence. Maybe it was interference. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe somewhere someone else was still sending our song. I didn't reply, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted it to echo. Some stories are stronger when unfinished. A few weeks later, a clerk handed me official papers. New identification, new address, new name. "You can stay here," he said. "Or go back to England. No one will check either way." I looked at the blank space beside name. My hand hovered above it. For years, I'd signed other people's names. Now, when I finally could write my own, I hesitated. In the end, I left it blank. I walked out of the office and into sunlight that didn't ask questions. The city was no longer divided between conqueror and conquered, only between those who remembered and those who tried not to. I was somewhere in between, as I crossed the bridge, the same one that once echoed with convoys and fear. I felt the wind shift, soft but certain. For the first time, it didn't smell like smoke. I closed my eyes and the melody returned, not from a violin or a radio, but from memory itself. 3 short, 2 long. A code, a song, a heartbeat. I realized then that I didn't need London's confirmation or Adler's permission. I had already become both echo and escape, and as I kept walking, the war stayed behind me. Not erased, but finally at peace.